At 77, Joyce DeWitt has finally said what she could not say for decades. Not about the salary dispute that ended Suzanne Somers' run. Not about the years she spent away from Hollywood, traveling the world, quietly rebuilding a life that the cameras had helped unravel. But about Norman Fell, the man who played Stanley Roper. The man who left the show at the height of its powers, whose departure changed Three's Company in ways the audience could feel without quite being able to name. The real story of why he left and what happened to him afterward is not the story that was ever told in the press releases. And it starts, as so many things in Hollywood do, not with money or ambition or creative differences, but with a promise that somebody didn't keep. Three's Company premiered on ABC on March 15th, 1977, and within a single season, it had become one of the most watched shows on American television. The premise was borrowed from a British sitcom called Man About the House. A young man moves in with two women, pretends to be gay so their old-fashioned landlord won't object, and the comedy writes itself from there. But what the American version had that the British original didn't was John Ritter. Ritter was a physical comedian of genuine brilliance. A man who could fall down a flight of stairs and make you feel something beyond laughter. Who could deliver a double entendre with his face while his voice stayed entirely innocent. Around him, the producers built a cast that clicked in the specific way that good ensemble television clicks. Not because everyone was doing the same thing, but because everyone was doing something different at exactly the right moment. Joyce DeWitt was Janet Wood, the calm one, the straight one, the one who made the comedy possible by being the person nobody was laughing at. She was born on April 23, 1949, in Wheeling, West Virginia, the daughter of Roland and Norma DeWitt, who moved the family to Speedway, Indiana, when Joyce was still young. Her father worked for a company that made automotive parts. Her mother was a homemaker. These were not people who had anything to do with show business. And Joyce's path into it, through Indiana University, where she studied theater, then all the way to a Master of Fine Arts and Theater Arts from UCLA in 1974, was a path she had essentially built alone on the strength of a conviction that she was going to do this, and a talent that her instructors kept confirming she had. She had done small television work before Three's Company. An episode here, a commercial there. Nothing that suggested what was coming. When she was cast as Janet, she was 27 years old and working the roles that most actresses in their late 20s work when they're between the thing that has not happened yet and the thing that is about to. She understood the show's mechanics from the beginning. Janet was not the laugh getter. Janet was the structure the laughs hung on. That is a less glamorous job and a harder one. And Joyce did it without complaint for 8 seasons, which is a kind of professional discipline that people who haven't done ensemble comedy tend to underestimate. The show hit its rhythm in the first season and never lost it. And a significant part of that rhythm was the Ropers. Norman Fell played Stanley Roper, the landlord of the Santa Monica apartment building, a man of deep skepticism, mild bigotry, and a marriage that had somehow survived decades of mutual exasperation. Audra Lindley played his wife Helen, and together they were something that Three's Company's young audience perhaps didn't fully appreciate in the moment, but absolutely felt. They were what happens after the romantic comedy ends. Stanley and Helen had been young and in love once, presumably, and what was left was this affection buried under decades of bickering. A man who used headaches as an excuse. A woman who saw through every excuse he had ever made and loved him anyway. The chemistry between Fell and Lindley was not manufactured. It was the chemistry of two actors who trusted each other completely and let that trust show. Norman Fell was born March 24th, 1924, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Russian Jewish immigrants who had come to America carrying very little except the specific stubbornness of people who have decided to survive. His real name was Normanfeld. The family name was changed somewhere along the road, as family names often were in that generation, smoothed down for an America that was more comfortable with certain sounds than others. He grew up in a row house in northeast Philadelphia, the The kind of neighborhood where nobody had much and everybody knew it, and the neighborhood held together anyway on the basis of that shared knowledge. He served in the Army Air Corps during World War II, flew missions, came home. He studied at the Actors Studio in New York on the GI Bill, which is where he learned to do the thing he would spend the rest of his life doing. He worked steadily for years before Three's Company. Television guest spots, character parts in films. The kind of career that makes a man a familiar face without ever quite making him a name. He was in The Graduate. He was in Bullet. He was in Ocean's 11, the 1960 original, playing alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. in a room full of men who knew how to own a room. He was the kind of actor other actors trusted. The kind casting directors called when they needed a scene elevated by someone who understood exactly what the scene was for. He had been doing this for a very long time before Stanley Roper. And all of those years showed up in the character. In the timing, in the expressions, in the particular way Fell could look directly at the camera with a smile that said he knew something the audience knew and nobody else on screen did. Three's Company ran its first season, and the Ropers were such a hit that ABC began talking almost immediately about a spin-off. The Ropers, Stanley and Helen, moved to a California condo. New comedy, same marriage. The concept was sound, the characters were beloved, and the network was willing to pay real money to make it happen. Norman Fell did not want to leave Three's Company. This is the part that the official version of events has always glossed over. The press at the time framed the spin-off as an opportunity Fell and Lindley were eager to pursue. Two beloved characters getting their own show. A natural evolution. Everybody happy. The reality was more complicated. Fell had built something at Three's Company that he valued. And he knew, with the instinct of a man who had been in the business for 25 years, that spin-offs are riskier than they look from the outside. The Ropers would be carrying the full weight of audience expectation with none of the ensemble support that had made the characters work. On Three's Company, Stanley and Helen existed in contrast to youth and chaos. Alone, they would have to be the whole show. The producers made him a promise. If the Ropers didn't work, if it was canceled, he could come back to Three's Company. His role would be there. The door would be open. On the strength of that promise, Norman Fell signed a contract and walked out of apartment 201. The Ropers debuted on March 13th, 1979, and the first season performed well enough to justify the risk. The show drew solid numbers. Not Three's Company numbers, but real numbers. The network felt validated. Then ABC moved it to a new time slot. The numbers fell. The second season struggled. By 1980, after 26 episodes across 2 seasons, The Ropers was canceled. Norman Fell went back to the producers to collect on the promise. The promise, as it turned out, had an asterisk. The contract, the actual language as opposed to the verbal assurances, specified that Fell could return to Three's Company if The Ropers was canceled within its first season. It had not been canceled within its first season. It had run 2 seasons and then been canceled. 1 extra season. Technically, on paper, the condition had not been met. The producers held the line. Norman Fell was not coming back. He had given up his place in one of the most successful sitcoms in American television history on the basis of a promise that the people who made it had structured, whether deliberately or carelessly, in a way that protected them and not him. A man who had spent his entire career being careful, being professional, being the actor that other people relied on. He had been careful and professional and reliable, and it had cost him everything he had built. Don Knotts came in as the new landlord, Ralph Furley. And Knotts was genuinely funny in the role. A physical comedian with decades of experience, whose Barney Fife on the Andy Griffith Show had made him one of the most recognizable comic actors in America. But the show was different with him there. And the people who had loved the Ropers felt the absence, not as a conscious thought, but as a texture. Something slightly warmer and more complicated had been replaced with something brighter and simpler. And while brighter and simpler worked, it wasn't the same. Joyce DeWitt watched all of this from inside apartment 201. She has not talked extensively about the Norman Fell situation in public. She is, by temperament and by training, someone who processes things more privately than publicly. But she has said, in the years since, enough to make clear that the manner of his departure left something in the company that didn't fully heal. She had worked alongside Fell for 2 seasons. She understood what he had brought to the show and what the show owed him for it. The mechanics of how he left, the promise, the contract language, the door that had been presented as open and turned out to be locked, were not lost on her. She was also watching something else. What the industry did to people when it was finished with them. Three's Company ran until 1984. By then, Joyce had spent 8 years playing the same character, had become one of the most recognized faces in American television, and had built a career that was also, in some important respects, a cage. Janet Wood had made her famous. Janet Wood had also made it very difficult for anyone in Hollywood to see her as anything else. The offers that came after the show ended were offers to play variations on Janet. The same competence, the same warmth, the same function. She turned them down. The offers slowed. In 1983, before the show had even finished its run, she was arrested on charges related to drunk driving. She has talked about this period with honesty. The pressure of the show, the strangeness of fame, the specific trap that 8 years of playing someone else can set for the person you actually are. She went to therapy. She took time. And then, in a move that surprised everyone who thought they understood her career trajectory, she largely stepped away. She appeared in a Three's Company reunion special in 1993. She remained, over the years, one of the people who spoke most honestly about what the show had been, the good and the difficult and the things in between. When Suzanne Somers was fighting with the producers over salary, it was Joyce who had to shoot around her, who absorbed the schedule disruptions and the tension on set and kept showing up and doing the work. When Somers was written out, it was Joyce and John Ritter who held the show together while the audience adjusted to Jenny Harrison and then to Priscilla Barnes. She was the constant, not the star, the spine. John Ritter died on September 11th, 2003, at 54 years old, of an aortic dissection, a tear in the main artery from the heart that had gone undetected, and that killed him before the doctors who were treating what they thought was a heart attack understood what was actually happening. He was on the set of 8 Simple Rules when it started. He was gone within hours. Joyce has spoken about his death with a grief that has not faded into something manageable over the years. He was her partner for 8 years of television. The person she showed up for every day. The man whose specific genius she had understood from the inside in a way that very few people could. She has said she still talks to him in a way that people say they still talk to someone they have lost when they mean that the conversation never really ended. Norman Fell did not live to see the show fully reclaimed by nostalgia. He died on December 14th, 1998, at 74 years old, in Los Angeles, of cancer. He had kept working after the Three's Company years. Television appearances, small film roles, the steady professional life of an actor who was too disciplined to stop even when the industry had stopped paying close attention. But the big thing, the thing that had been building towards something, had ended on a contract technicality. He spent the last 18 years of his life in the business being remembered as Stanley Roper, beloved in reruns, nostalgic in the interviews he gave when people came looking for him. He was gracious in those interviews. He was funny. He was, by all accounts, exactly what you would hope Stanley Roper's actual self would be. The question of whether he was at peace with how it ended is one he did not answer directly. What he said, in the interviews from the 1980s and 1990s, was that he had loved the show and had believed in the spin-off and had hoped the promise would be honored. He did not, in those interviews, say much more than that. Some things you keep. Audra Lindley, Helen Roper, his television wife of such beautifully calibrated exasperation, outlived him by 8 months. She died on October 16th, 1997. They had worked together on and off for years after the Ropers ended, and their friendship, by the accounts of people who knew them both, had the same quality as their on-screen relationship. The warmth buried under the bickering. The care that the comedy depended on. She was 79 years old. Joyce DeWitt, at 77, is the last of apartment 201 still standing. She does occasional stage work. She appears at conventions and events for fans of the show, where the audience that grew up with Three's Company finds her and tells her what it meant to them. She receives that with the same directness she brought to everything. Not performing gratitude, not deflecting, just taking it in as the real thing it is. She has said in the years since that she wishes Norman Fell had gotten what he was promised. That statement, simple and unadorned as it is, carries the weight of everything she knows about how that story ended. She was inside the show. She watched the producers make the calculation they made. She watched Fell leave on the basis of a promise and not come back. And she is still talking about it at 77 because some things do not fade just because enough years have passed. The real reason Norman Fell left Three's Company, it turns out, is not the reason anyone said at the time. He left because he was convinced it was safe to leave. Because someone in a position of power told him the door would stay open. It didn't. The door was closed by contract language that he should have read more carefully, and that the people who wrote it knew exactly what it said. He was an actor of the old school, a man whose generation had been trained to take a man at his word. And the word that was given to him turned out to be worth precisely what the contract allowed it to be worth, which was nothing. And Joyce DeWitt, the woman who played the calm one, the reliable one, the spine of apartment 201, she has spent the better part of 50 years making sure the real story gets told. Not loudly, not with anger, but clearly and with the specific kind of honesty that costs something when you offer it. Because the people it reflects poorly on are still attached, even now, to the reputation they spent Norman Fell's career building. Some debts never get paid, but the least you can do is make sure people know they exist. Three's Company made all of them, Joyce, Ritter, Summers, Fell, Lindley, into people that tens of millions of Americans felt they knew. And the particular cruelty of that kind of fame is that it demands everything from you, and then, when it's done with you, returns very little of what it took. Norman Fell gave it as Stanley Roper. He gave it 2 seasons of a spin-off that was canceled before it found its footing. He gave it the good faith of a man who believed that a promise made in a room full of people who shook his hand meant something. He got reruns and nostalgia and a cancer diagnosis and 18 years of being asked pleasantly how he felt about leaving the show. He was gracious. He was funny. He told the story as well as he could tell it. Joyce DeWitt is still telling it. At 77, with the same clear eyes she brought to Janet Wood for 8 seasons, she is still making sure the audience understands what actually happened in that apartment. Not the comedy, but the rest of it. The part that isn't in the reruns. The part that the laugh track doesn't cover. Some things you have to say out loud, even when it would be easier to let the rerun speak for you. Joyce DeWitt has always known the difference between easier and true.